Marvel Studios' Iron Man, the movie that birthed the most successful franchise of all time, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Iron Man was released so long ago, it has the Paramount logo at the beginning. I was 6 years old when this movie came out. I'm a junior in college now. Directed by Jon Favreau of Chef fame, Iron Man came out in 2008 and was the comic book movie's first real step into the mainstream. While it has a lot of formulaic elements that a lot of comic book movies get criticized for, Iron Man perfects that formula with great action, an easy-to-follow story, and great actors amplified by amazing actors. Robert Downey Jr. is Iron Man. There have been many great comic book movie castings over the years, such as Hugh Jackman's Wolverine or Heath Ledger's Joker, Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn, Nicolas Cage's Ghost Rider. No, I am not kidding with that last one. But I believe that Robert as Iron Man is the perfect comic book movie casting ever. I think the thing that separates Robert the most from these actors is that he is the character. In recent years, they have become synonymous with each other. And while there is an issue with actors not being able to escape certain roles, Robert has infused Tony Stark into who he is. Now, I have no idea if Robert was always like this or if he grew into the Tony Stark persona over time. But he has proven that he was born for this role. Marvel took a big risk with casting him. For those who are still unaware, Robert was pretty much blacklisted from Hollywood and had a serious battle with drug addiction. He was actually sent to the Los Angeles County Jail for 6 months after missing a court-ordered drug test in 1997 during his probation. Fun fact, the catalyst for Robert going straight was that he had a burger from Burger King that was so bad he realized right then and there that he needed to get his act together. Which is ironic considering the food that Tony wants after returning home is Burger King. Now, is that story 100% true? While I'm not so sure, it could be very hyperbolic, the fact that the story came from Robert himself just makes me want to believe it. Nowadays, instead of doing drugs, Robert just looks like a gay dad on Instagram. But the point still stands that after Robert got straight, it was still a very big deal he was in this movie. This was his second chance, and he was not going to throw it away. And boy, did it pay off. Ever since day one, his performance has been stellar. I'm not a big comic book guy, but even I know that Tony Stark isn't the most likable character. You could even argue that Tony in the MCU isn't very likable. But Robert was able to make this character ooze with charisma. From the opening scene, Tony is able to melt all tension away between him and the soldiers with a couple of jokes fueled by his charisma. Unfortunately, Tony couldn't charm his way out of getting kidnapped by terrorists. That being said, I really like the chaotic beginning that is followed by a flashback. I feel like if the movie were to open with the flashback scenes, it wouldn't have had that much of an impact. It makes sense that the ambush scene comes first so it can grab your attention, and then we can go back and see who Tony Stark was as a person before he became Iron Man. A rich asshole who sleeps with any semi-attractive woman and doesn't really know what his company does. Seeing this man who has been privileged his entire life having to carry around a car battery around a dirty cave in order to just stay alive is a really good contrast. It's his transition from being what Elon Musk is to what Elon Musk thinks he is. After being kidnapped, the Ten Rings give Tony the mission of building a missile. However, Tony has a very different invention in mind. I love this whole sequence of events because it really shows Tony's ingenuity. He invented the first miniature arc reactor, which he quite literally
build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
This is where Tony meets Yinsen, played by Sean Taub. I love Yinsen. While only being in 1/4 of the movie and never being mentioned by name in any future installments, Yinsen is one of the most important people to come into Tony's life throughout the entire MCU. Yinsen is Tony's only sense of normalcy while building the Mark I, and his first real wake-up call about what kind of destruction he's causing. We as the audience get more invested into Tony's escape because we want to see these two escape together. When Yinsen talks about seeing his family again, it gives him a goal that we can relate and empathize with, which makes his death much more impactful because his family is already dead. But his goal stayed the same. He still got to see his family by the end of this, and that was always his plan. But at the same time, it's easy to assume that Yinsen's family died because of Tony's influence. If the Ten Rings are using Stark weaponry to overpower people, who's to say that didn't happen to Yinsen's family? And at the end of it all, Yinsen also died because of Tony's influence. This then begs the question, who in this movie doesn't die because of Tony? That question alone is why Yinsen is so important. Tony's influence reaches farther than blueprints and factories. His name is printed on the weapons. These innocent people die knowing that Tony Stark had something to do with it. Tony realizing this is where I think his complexity as a character truly shines. When Tony comes back to the US, he makes a very good decision in shutting down the weapons department of his company. But Tony's mistake is, instead of believing that weapons aren't the answer, that weapons are only safe in his hands. This obviously leads him to make the Mark II suit, the sleek, clean, solid silver suit. What I like most about the Mark II is that we get to see Tony making it. Since they already had a montage of him making the Mark I, they could have easily just had him mess with some holographic blueprints, mess with a welder, slap the suit on him and call it a day. But no, instead they show Tony looking at what did and didn't work for the Mark I and amplifying that times 1000. We see that Tony needs stabilizers on his feet to fly because the repulsors on his hands are too strong, which then teases the repulsor blasts. If it were to go from him having the idea of improving the suit and immediately jumping to him having the suit, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. Instead, it shows that he put in a lot of work and it feels earned. And while this isn't as in-depth as him building the Mark I, you still believe that this is the same guy that did, just with more resources. And it all leads to the flight test scene, which is just awesome. And it's awesome for the reason that you may not expect. You see, the process of me taking notes for this movie had a side effect that caught me off guard. It made me listen to the music. I have never been one to go out of my way and listen to a movie's soundtrack. Unless it's a song I recognize, I'm always more focused on the action or what the characters are saying. But the music that plays during this test flight just makes the scene so much cooler. It has a very metallic sound to it while also having a lot of rock influence that just screams Tony Stark. It feels modern in comparison to the score that plays during the construction of the Mark I, which has a lot more of an industrial assembly line feel to it. You can even compare these two with the score that plays with the Mark III during the fight scene in Golmyra. That score has a much more heroic yet brooding tone to it. All three suits have their own themes, and while they have the same bass sound, they all stand out in their own ways that expresses the different stages of Iron Man. I have to give props to Ramin Djawadi for his amazing work on this soundtrack, and this makes me very excited to finally listen to the soundtracks of other movies going forward. Speaking of the Mark III, this is the suit that solidifies Tony Stark as Iron Man. When Tony learns that his weapons are still being manufactured and shipped off somehow, he travels to Golmyra to dispose of them himself, while also dealing some much-deserved payback. Paired with one of the best super suit-ups of all time, seeing Iron Man in action for the first time is just awesome. From the crisp sounds of the repulsor blast, to seeing the hub from his perspective and targeting different opponents. This is how you show a hero in action for the first time. And while the CGI is a bit clunky, it holds up rather well. It definitely holds up better than some of the CGI in current MCU movies. But of course, when the main character finally bears the title of the movie, they start affecting the people in their lives. Since Happy is only in one scene in this movie, Pepper and Rhodey are really the only people that are in Tony's life. Despite Obadiah, but we'll talk about him later. Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, is Tony's secretary and love interest. One thing I really like about Pepper in this movie is that Tony relies on her. It sometimes feels like the love interests in these movies are just there to be saved and have their obligatory kiss scene. MJ. And while Pepper does need to be saved at one point at the very end, she actively assists Tony while also fearing for his life every second. She helps him replace his arc reactor. She helps him steal some super secret files. She overloads the big reactor in order to save his life, and she even gives him the classic proof that Tony Stark has a hard gift that always makes me smile. Basically, she has shit to do. And not every love interest in these movies gets that opportunity. But the one thing that I really like about Pepper is that she doesn't end up with Tony in the end. Obviously, that doesn't last very long, but it makes sense why they wouldn't get together in this first outing. In case you didn't know, Tony is a dick. I'd be mad too if my scripted love interest abandoned me at some party with a bunch of weird rich people. Well, other weird rich people. But the point still stands that Tony didn't earn her love. Because while he is a superhero, he's still Tony Stark. The world is always going to revolve around him. Terrence Howard plays Colonel James Rhodes, or Rhodey, in this movie despite never being in any future MCU project after being replaced by Don Cheadle. For the longest time, I didn't even know why Terrence was replaced. From the couple articles that I read, the gist of it is that Terrence was signed on for multiple movies, given the War Machine tease. But after the major success of the first Iron Man, Robert got a massive pay raise for Iron Man 2. Terrence, however, did not. After trying to strike some sort of deal and even getting ghosted by Robert based on some context clues Terrence gave, he later stepped down from the role and the role was given to Don. And honestly, I can't really blame him. Given the much bigger role Rhodey was going to get for Iron Man 2, Terrence wanting a raise is completely understandable. I love Don as Rhodey, and while I do think him being in the role worked out in the long run, I still feel really bad for Terrence. For this movie and this movie alone, Terrence did a really good job. Rhodey is always tired of Tony's shit, and Terrence portrays that perfectly with his dry yet sarcastic delivery. However, Rhodey doesn't have very much to do. He covers for Tony when it's convenient, but unlike Pepper, he's not in the dirt like she is. I guess that's just because I'm so used to Rhodey being in the War Machine suit, it's weird seeing him just be a normal army guy. But I do think he has some of the best jokes right behind Tony, and you can really tell they have a good friendship.
That lovely lady you woke up with, what was his name?
Tony may want to lay off the transphobic jokes though. Anyway, no comic book movie is complete without a villain, and this movie has two. It's a bit surreal seeing the Ten Rings in the first ever MCU movie when we just got an entire movie dedicated to them in recent years thanks to Shang-Chi. And based on the ending of Shang-Chi, we'll be seeing them again in the future, which is really, really cool. But unfortunately, the Ten Rings do get overshadowed by the main villain. I feel like if I had never seen this movie before, I would truly believe that Raza, played by Faran Tahir, would be the big bad. I mean, why wouldn't you believe that? The movie literally goes out of its way to show Raza finding the remnants of the Mark I and sulking. But there is a very quick turnaround that shows that Obadiah Stane, the Ironmonger, is the main villain. And it's funny because before being revealed as the main villain, Obadiah is probably one of the least intimidating people I have ever seen in my life. During one of the earlier scenes, Obadiah FaceTimes Tony, shirtless, while in his bed. Oh, and Obadiah can play piano, because, you know, that's a good talent to have. Oh, and he rides a Segway, because although he isn't intimidating, that doesn't mean he isn't cool. In all seriousness though, the tonal shift from him being a goof to a menace took me aback, but it was so cool. It took me by surprise how quick the switch was, but I welcomed it. Because when Jeff Bridges is able to show off his acting chops, he has such a threatening aura. Him using the sonic tasers just made me feel uneasy as he just towers over Raza and Tony while they're just writhing in pain. Now, with that being said, I do have some issues with Obadiah. Jeff Bridges was an amazing choice, but I feel like he could have been a lot better if he just had more time. I don't really know what his motive is. I'm all for villains who are evil just to be evil, but villains still need a motive. I don't feel like Obadiah had any real reason to be the bad guy other than to be in power and to make money. It didn't even seem like Howard Stark had anything to do with it. He didn't seem to wrong Obadiah in any way or deny him what he rightfully deserved. And that may be because Obadiah actually respected Howard and trusted him with the company, unlike Tony, who he felt was too immature to make the tough calls. I really feel like the Ironmonger could have been a better villain if he had a more compelling motive. My other issue isn't so much with the Ironmonger himself, but more with the final battle in general. The sequence does open with a really cool suit reveal paired with a chilling, ear-ringing music that makes the scene very impactful, but the fight scene itself was kind of a letdown. While the fight does have a nice callback to the suit freezing if it goes too high, showing that Tony's suit is superior, it doesn't have anything as cool as that. I would even argue that it has one of the least cool scenes in any fight scene ever. Just hit him, Obadiah! Jeff Bridges is cool, the Ironmonger is cool, but I wish the fight scene was cool, because I had so much left to be desired. Other than that though, there isn't much that I dislike about this movie. I don't think some of the jokes aged very well, and I think there are some plot conveniences that I'm still puzzled at. I still don't understand how Tony and Yinsen were able to hide the Mark I for that long. They're obviously not building a missile, those Ten Ring goons are just idiots. Iron Man is such a strong start to the MCU. If this movie wasn't as good as it was, I highly doubt people would have been as on board with this extended universe. Because at the very end, the first post-credit scene in the MCU, Nick Fury emerges from the shadows to talk about the Avengers Initiative.
You become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet.
Oh, how right you were, Director Fury. I don't think any of us could have predicted what this franchise was going to grow into, but I am more than happy with what it has become. Iron Man was the first big step into bringing superheroes into the mainstream. It's funny, it's exciting, and Robert Downey Jr. delivers one of the most iconic comic book movie lines ever.
I am Iron Man.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed my review of Iron Man, please leave a like and comment below your thoughts on the movie. I'd love to hear them. Be sure to subscribe in order to catch future reviews, and I'll be sure to save you a seat and some popcorn for when they drop. Safe travels, movie lovers!